Hey.
Are we good?
Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm Ahndraya Parlato, and I'm going to be talking about my new book, Who Has Changed and Who Is Dead, which is a hybridic project using text and image, using the death of my mom and the act of becoming a mother to explore parental anxiety, the construction of gender, and mortality. And today I'll be talking to Charlie Engman, who also has an amazing new book out about his mom.
Yes, this is my book entitled Mom. It's a 10-year collaborative project that I've been doing with my mother. And I guess the themes of which are pretty overlapping with Andrea's work, and we'll dive into all of that as we go, I guess. Yeah, so here we are. So should we just dive right in and get into the meat of the book, or?
I guess so. Yeah, sure.
Sure, okay. So the first thing that really struck me about your book, which is very beautiful, is obviously its use of text. It has, I'd say, almost as much text as it has imagery. I just wanted to talk to you about why you decided to include text, what kind of methodology you used in doing that, what type of relationship you feel text and image have with each other, what your process was in organizing those type of things. One thing that occurred to me as I was reading through the actual text that you wrote and thinking through my own ideas around photography, it occurred to me that photography and text and writing both have a sort of relationship to preservation, about sort of holding down something or arresting something that is necessarily sort of ephemeral or non-physical. I just was wondering if that kind of tracks with your ideas of those things and, about your process.
That's like a question with a million questions rolled into
it.
But, sure. So I've always have really loved the way that text and image can extend each other in the best case scenario, rather than say illustrate or describe, but really kind of be this metaphoric extension of whatever ideas they're individually grappling with. And so in my prior works, there was always a textual component as well, but I just was not the person to write it. Right. But when I started making this body of work, there were just kind of various anecdotes and stories that were popping up in my head that I felt like relaying that information of was really key to the work itself, and it couldn't come from anywhere else. So I had to start writing it down. And it was definitely a terrifying act because I don't fancy myself a writer in any way. And I was very guiltily kind of writing it down for a while, kind of asking myself how much, I had this idea, how much text will I be allowed to get away with? I don't know who this imaginary person letting me get away with it would be. Yeah. But because, there's this idea that a photo should speak for itself, or there shouldn't be if it's good, it doesn't need, and so it was actually one day I was talking to my good friend, Nicholas Molnar, and he just casually referenced the project as a hybridic project that wasn't a photo project. And when he said that, it was this super freeing act in my head where I was oh, shit, that's right. It's not a photo project. I can write as much as I want. No one can stop me. And then I felt I could really lean into the act of writing itself. And I think what the writing did for me is that the use of the words my and you and your and mom, all those words are really kind of universal, and they allow a viewer to really project themselves into that headspace in a way that images don't always allow you to project your literal self into something. So I think they implicate the audience more than an image would.
That's interesting, because a thought that just occurred to me when you talked about having a transformation of concept around the work just by using a different name for it, by calling it a hybrid project rather than calling it a photo project or writing project. That it strikes me that there's maybe a similar dynamic with these words mom and child and motherhood and you and me even are actually they have sort of fixed terminology where you feel that there are certain those are certain roles that have certain boundaries and obligations, and maybe actually by just sort of shifting your perspective on them or your kind of relationship to those things, it actually opens up a different space for you to to feel more liberty doing things in a different way, or a way that is maybe less kind of codified or conventional. I mean, obviously there's a lot of conversation in the book, in your writing, and just in the work generally, and also in my book, about like what roles mean in that way. So like, what does it mean to be a mother? What type of responsibilities attend that? How does that affect one's kind of personal identity and the identity of like one's children? I don't know if you have thoughts any of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think words are like, one thing that is really interesting about words is that they can either like be really freeing, like the proper expression of something can really like shift your perspective on your relationship to it or your entry point into it, but then they can also be really oppressive. Right. So like categories and titles and those roles can also become like really fixed and make you feel like entrenched. And so there's like kind of this, I don't know, like indistinct back and forth that can happen when you name things or like when you define them, like
right, because you know, something you write, an anecdote you have in the book is about one of your children being like, I'm the mom, you're the baby, and how that sort of shifted over time, and how at one point you sort of played along with her, and then you were like, no, but I'm the baby. Yeah, and then at one point she was like, no, but you're the mom, I'm the baby, obviously. And I'm curious about how you experienced that sort of like shifting and play and like use of different words. And
I mean, I think it's like kind of always shifting. Like I remember like with my own mom, like when she would have like bad dreams, like she would wake me up in the middle of the night and like make me come sleep with her, which is like kind of what little kids do, right? Where they like crawl into their parents' bed when they like have bad dreams. But I was like fulfilling that like, you know, comforting presence for her.
Right.
And like it didn't feel weird at all. It felt like I'm the person who lives with you. Like I'm gonna be that comforting like presence for you. But I think that like it's and you know, it's funny, it's like in society you like kind of have this idea of like you'll take care of like children when they're little, and then like they'll circle back and like take care of you. And I think that like, I guess because my mom was mentally ill, like even as a child, I always had this responsibility or like feeling of caretaking towards her that I was like really aware of. Like I remember being like pretty young and like feeling this anxiety about like literally like the trajectory in my head was like, I have to get good grades in school so I can get into a good college, so I can get a good job, so I can buy a house that has another house on the property for my mom. Yeah. Wow. Like, how am I going to shelter my mom? But I was like 10, you know?
Right.
And like, so I think that, and even I see it like with my kids, like if I burn myself cooking or something, like my littlest kid is really, she's like very tuned into that. So like, ow, she's like, Mama, are you okay? Like she checks in, and it's like, it's I don't know. I guess I didn't realize how blended and indistinct those subjectivities are in those relationships, like until I became a mom, even though I had experienced it like as a child.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's clearly this sort of like ambiguity or ambivalence around what responsibility and like who bears responsibility to whom, and like who is caring for who and when, and how those things kind of relate to each other. I
mean, it seems like at the end of in your book, the last conversation in your book, which is a conversation between Miranda July and your mom, they're kind of talking about your mom is basically expressing this feeling that the act of being photographed by you for so long in so many ways has kind of revealed this multitude of selves to her that she wasn't always aware that she had. And she like expresses this fear of like subsequently being alienated from her peers after having this realization of like herself as these other selves. And so like, does that make you feel responsible? Like, wow, you just like how you like now this person feels like a new person because of this project you did, and like, what's your like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something that I'm digging deep into with my therapist currently is like, what type of responsibility
is a blessing or like
I mean, because there's this like general responsibilities that are sort of lived and embodied, which is about motherhood and being a child, and what type of debt is owed to those types of people. I'm actually reading right now David Graeber's book about the history of debt, and he has a really amazing section about just this sort of fantasy that we all owe something to society and to our families or whatever, and how tricky that dynamic actually is, because it's obviously something that cannot actually really be repaid.
Right.
So like, what is the dynamic there if people actually feel that there's some sort of responsibility, and how does what are the dynamics of the responsibility? Something that I think about all the time.
Is it projected
Sure.
responsibility?
Yeah, when it doesn't feel like it. It feels like there's like a concrete responsibility there. I mean, and we can get into this more later, but like, one thing I really noted in your book is that like you feel a very present responsibility to just like the physical and emotional safety of your children. There's a through line of violence about, your grandmother was murdered, your mother killed herself, and you as a woman yourself you talk a lot about fear of being attacked or raped or just even being in an accident. There's a lot of like anecdotes about accidents. And so there is this sort of like constant idea of responsibility literally over a physical responsibility to people.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like, I used to, like, before kids, and I say this in the book, but, like, I was unable to, like, tap into any fear of death, of, like, my own self dying. Like, I really just was like, someday I won't be here. Like, it's not the end of the world. Like, it didn't freak me out. And then after having kids, it was just like, it was almost like it was an extension of my responsibility to them to like keep myself alive and like keep myself healthy.
Right.
And so like it became like an extension of a caretaking for them in this weird way where I'm like, well, now I'm really fucking terrified of dying, but I'm actually not terrified of dying, but like I can't leave you hanging.
Right.
Like, and so it was like a weird vicarious shift.
That's interesting. So Maggie Nelson has this amazing phrase, which I think about all the time, that she writes about in her book, The Argonauts, where she's describing her own mother, as having a sort of prophylactic anxiety, an anxiety about preventative care, basically. And she's obviously talking about her mother in that context. And it's interesting to me to think that maybe, and it sounds to me like for you, the act of becoming a mother or being cognizant of this idea of like mothering something changed your relationship to anxiety in some type of way. Does that track? Do you feel that is... Was there a change?
I mean, I think I'm always like have like a very like repressed relationship to anxiety where like I don't think of myself as someone who like connotes to the world like as anxious. Like I think people for the most part like, oh, she's pretty chill.
Yeah, you write in the book that people observe of you as being like a good,
like I had a good friend
mother,
the other day on the phone. She was like, I've known you for 20 years and I like didn't know you were like had this much anxiety until I read your book, and this was such like a funny way to like learn this information about someone that I'm so close to. And it's because it's like I do, and I think it's like a necessary caretaking mechanism to like repress that anxiety, because essentially like if you were like mindful of it or aware of it all the time, I feel like it would be like paralyzing. Like you wouldn't be able to move forward. Yeah. So I don't know that it like changed my relationship to like in the day-to-day like how I live or how I act, but it definitely like brought that awareness of like the act of repressing to like I became aware of that in myself, like what I was doing, like, as opposed to being like I'm not anxious. I was just like I'm basically projecting my anxiety onto like much smaller things to like create subterfuge around like the larger, more scary issues.
Right. Yeah, because I just wonder if there is some sort of like substantive relationship between anxiety and motherhood, because when I read this phrase prophylactic anxiety in Maggie Nelson, I just identified it so strongly in my own mother. And then reading your book too, like, I see it happening in you of like thinking about your children getting literally murdered in school, for example, is like a through line in the book. And I just wonder if there is some relationship there. So
much caretaking though, I think, is predicated on prophylaxis. Like, it's like, why do we brush our teeth every day? Like, because we don't want to get cavities. It's not because you have a cavity in the moment, right? It's like, so it's like, you have to do this, but it's always like, so you don't do this, right? Or like, why do you have to nap? Well, actually, so you don't have a meltdown later. Like, it's like everything feels like in advance of itself, which almost makes it feel like there can be like a logic to it in the moment. Or like, why are we doing this thing now? Right, so that this other thing doesn't happen in 5 hours or 2 days or next year. And it's like weird.
Well, and I guess motherhood is a sort of, or like this word that you use, which I think is really beautiful in the book, matrescence, becoming a mother. I wonder if that like there is a sort of process of externalizing that anxiety, right? Where like now there's actually an object of that anxiety, whereas before, we all brush our teeth or take a nap or whatever as self-care, which is like directed towards us and like obviously affects the people that we're around and relate to, but like maybe there's a different feeling of responsibility, to go back to that idea of responsibility.
Sure. But also it's like the act of becoming a mom is like just like such not a concrete thing, because like the needs of mothering like a newborn baby are like totally different than the needs of mothering a toddler than they are like, so it's like always like shifting. Like a teenager's not going to need the same thing that my kids needs now, so it's like it's like once you're like have come into the mother for that moment, it's like you need to like there needs to like be like a new mother for like the next moment or something. It's like you're never done. I
was thinking too about this this idea of like identity formation, which I think attends this question of responsibility of like who is responsible for whom. I think there's also this idea of like who is changing who, what effect do we have on other people essentially. And there's a thing that you write in the book which struck me, where you say okay, I guess you read about this woman who didn't remember her dad because her dad died when she was 3. When she was 3, and your child is 3, at least at the time of writing. You were thinking like, oh my God, if I die now, then that's like the end of my formation, my like impact on her identity formation, which I'm not sure that tracks for me. I would imagine that like the death of a mother and like the absence of a biological mother would continue to have some kind of identity formation process.
Sure.
But there's this idea that like, okay, I think we all kind of easily accept that a mother it has some impact on the identity of the child, but maybe there's a little bit of a less talked about transference of the other direction of how the child actually transforms the mother and what type of dynamics are there. And maybe there's a little bit of violence inherent in that too. In my book, I have an essay written by Rachel Cusk. And the reason I asked Rachel to write for me is because I'd read a book of hers called A Life's Work, where she really details like the struggle of becoming a mother and the sort of violence that's inherent in that, and the sort of like alienation, to use that word again, from herself, where she realized like, oh, I'm no longer. I have to reformat myself. I'm not myself who I was. This is like an actual shift and a transformation of selfhood. I mean it definitely, because it's like you have to you don't have to. In an ideal world, I think there's probably like an equal balance, but for at least a certain time, it does mean like, a newborn, like literally if you left them and you walked away, like they would die. Right. So like the responsibility is like profound. Is palpable, so like there is this moment where it feels like I think as humans, we're like used to kind of like navigating the world at the center of it, like with our needs essentially kind of trumping the needs around us, right? Or like we're predicated on that. But then it's like when you become a parent, all of a sudden, like, there's this other creature's needs that have to kind of trump your needs, because, like, if that didn't happen, they could die. Like, just so directly. Right. There's, like, very practical reasons for that, And then you're just like, whoa, what does it mean to just, like, not be, like, the sole, like, nuclei, like, you're, like, sharing this position. I don't know. Well, that's interesting, too, because when I think about my own position in that, and I've thought about this from time to time, because I have a mother who is like just very deeply invested in me as her child. She's sort of like an mother type of person. That's my experience of her. And so because of that, I've had thoughts occasionally where I'm like, if I die, she will die.
You felt like the weight and reverse of that.
Yeah, which, you actually talk about the inverse of that, where there's a passage in your book where you talk about like, if a mother has one child and that child dies, then she kind of has permission to kill herself, and that might actually be like a freedom and a release.
Right.
But if there's a second child that the mother has to stay alive, then actually the death of one child and not both children is actually like a really deep violence towards, or I don't know how to describe it even, but how just profound that pain is. And I've thought too, like, maybe I actually have like a responsibility, even though I'm not a mother, and I won't be I can't be a mother, biologically. I'm also a queer person, so like my relationship to family is just necessarily socially different and codified in a different way. But even still, then obviously, just by dint of having family, having a mother, there is like a weird sort of sense of responsibility that I feel. That I haven't figured out.
I definitely felt that too, towards my mom, and like a lot of guilt about like, you know, like if my life was better, if I was aware that my life was better than hers, or I was having fun, am I still gonna understand that like within her mental illness or like her situation, like why did I have the right, like almost like a survivor guilt of like, why would I have the right when she didn't? But I guess it's interesting to hear you say that you also feel this like kind of two-way channel and of responsibility towards her. I remember like the first time we spoke, you were saying that you started taking pictures of your mom like basically out of convenience because like you needed a body and she was a willing body who was there and was like willing to model for you. And I loved you said like you felt like she was modeling for you almost like as an extension of her like motherly duty, like okay, Charlie needs this thing and I can like fulfill it. And then you kind of said like after a few years you realized like you had to like reconcile with the fact that this like body belonged to a person in a specific role. And I was wondering like we didn't actually at that time talk like what did that reconciliation like look like when you like were like okay, it's not actually just a body, like this body is attached to my mom, and like how did that shift like your process and like your image making, or just even did it shift your image making or just your thought process, or what did it do for you?
I mean for me that's definitely an ongoing process. I mean I kind of think on some level it's sort of impossible to understand people as full people outside of yourself, you know, like that's just like the constant conundrum.
Like parents,
especially
kids,
parents
and children. I mean that direction.
Yeah, because there's such a closeness and there's this idea of like I am an extension of you or you are an extension of me in some way. You know, and obviously every family dynamic is different, but for my situation, absolutely, like my mother was just like a very overwhelming presence for me. She was constantly there and she wanted to be there and she inserted herself in my life constantly and continues to do so. And I sort of like, by turn, like invite her in and beckon her and sort of respond to that in my own way. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like, I'm not sure I fully still actually recognize her autonomy. You know what I mean? It's like, I recognize in myself that there's sort of an intellectual appreciation and awareness of that doesn't necessarily actually match my sort of emotional and actually like practical interactions with her. There is this very interesting dynamic of how to sort of like reflect on yourself and think like, okay, what's actually happening here and what is her autonomy and what is my autonomy and how do those things meet each other? And as the work developed, I really had to sort of like proactively kind of release myself from trying to sort of control certain outcomes or certain visualizations. You know, now that the book is out, I get asked a lot like, okay, well, what is next? Like how you know, my mother is still living and, you know, we still have a relationship, obviously. And so now like, okay, is there a continuation of this project? Is this it? And for me, I've been thinking about like, where is that question coming from? And like, what is next actually? And to me, there is this sort of like, what I'm kind of invested in right now is actually seeing how the act of sort of representing her in this way and the sort of accumulation of all that time and experience doing that over, you know, 10 plus years of making the book, now that that's been kind of externalized and she has a sort of like public face, this sort of like distal face that's like outwards and is like actually not that much about me and her anymore and is actually about like her and us and everyone else. What kind of comes out of that? You know, like I work professionally a lot in fashion and there is a lot of sort of fashion adjacent images in the book. And so out of that, now she is working kind of professionally as a model and she's sort of interfacing with the fashion industry as a result of this book. And to me, that seems like the most interesting, and I have nothing to do with that. You know, I'm not commissioning her to model in that way. I'm not really sort of like pushing her to do those things even. So to me, it's like chasing the tail of the work and seeing how actually it does now affect her own identity formation. I don't know if that actually is speaking to what you asked about, but
it does. And it also makes me, I was wondering like at what point, like in this 10-year period, like when hair and makeup kind of started coming into play and how that like shifted her performances, so to speak, like once that became, because I imagine in the beginning it was like just you guys, like there wasn't like a crew.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And so like at that point, like after your career had built a little and kind of you combine those two things, like did you notice a shift in the collaborative process, or just in her performance specifically, or like how did that just change things?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I think about how, and based on the conversations I've had with my mom, when I think about like where she really thrived in the project and where she, like, one of the things she really appreciated, I think, about making the work is actually having those relationships to these people. She was really fascinated, just even on like a skill technical level, about how people can manipulate hair or skin or whatever. And she was just excited to actually learn about those type of things. So there was an interesting dynamic there. But yeah, for sure, I think like the more kind of externalized our relationship got, where it wasn't just me and her and our interpersonal dynamics, where there was actually, I could bring in other people and say like, okay, here's this person, and how do you want to like inflect this person? What type of reactions do you have to her physical presence and her emotional presence? Because she's, you know, she's present. She's not just like a body there being interacted with. She kind of has like interests and curiosities that affect, you know, what type of augmentation those people are going to bring to her. And so I think, yeah, again, it's this like opening it up and bringing more people in. I mean, this is like the whole question I have about photography and writing in general, is like, okay, we're offering something that's deeply personal and deeply private. We're offering it up to some audience that we necessarily don't have any type of substantive relationship with. And what does it mean to do that? And why would we do that? And I think, yeah, starting to bring in other practitioners and other people who had kind of creative inclinations towards her, you know, and there's a lot of different dynamics. Sometimes I would be very explicit and, you know, use them as a tool and tell them what to do. But oftentimes it would be like, okay, here we are having an experience together. Let's just all collaborate and see what happens and see how that dynamic feels. And yeah, to me, it was really about kind of breaking open these ideas of roles of like control and subject and author and participant.
I mean, it seems like in a lot of ways your project, like, I mean, we were talking about like how, you know, like parents shape children and children shape parents, but it actually seems like, you know, maybe one thing to touch on is like how the act of like the art making itself also changes the person. Like now that like you're saying like your mom, like, you know, she's trying to model, she wants, like, it's almost like after this collaboration, she has like found some part of herself that wants to continue on in this like modality, like with or without you, kind of.
Right.
And it's interesting, like even the other day, like my oldest daughter said to me, like she like referenced like the next book that she would be in of mine.
Interesting.
And I was like,
wow, interesting.
And I was like, but how do you know I'm like even gonna keep doing this?
Yeah.
And she was like, well, like I'm still here.
Right.
And I was like, well, yeah, but. And it was just like, I could tell she was kind of like, we're like going to keep going with this, right?
Oh, interesting.
And I felt like, even though she's so young, like there was some part of her that had felt seen.
Yeah, I did want to ask about that. Yeah, it's like what your children's reaction was to, I mean, also because your husband and their father is also a photographer.
Yeah.
So I was very curious just to hear about their relationship to photography and their experience of being photographed.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. So they like don't get how like small like my world is. So they like think they're really famous. You know, I'm like, actually, you're not famous. But they like feel famous.
Interesting.
So, but they're into
famous.
that. They're like aware.
Okay,
like,
so like again, the specter of the audience is like they're aware. Okay,
yes, yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, I think my oldest daughter, like if I like feel intuitively like she's gonna be a theater kid or something. Like like the other day she said to me,
performative.
She said, Mama, I told my friends at school about the skeleton in my closet. And I was like, the skeleton in your closet? What's that? And she was like, I really like looking at myself in the mirror. And I was like, but it's funny because I have been for years like noticing that like if we're fighting or something and there's a mirror, she'll like perform her emotion a little bit more for the mirror, and it drives me fucking crazy because I feel like she's like hamming it up for like not me. And I'll be like, stop it, like stop crying for the mirror. And so when she told me I really like looking in the mirror, the first thing I said, I was like, well, that's pretty common for like kids your age, you know? And she's like, but no, Mama, I really like looking at myself in the mirror. And I was like, you know, I've been telling you this for years and you won't admit it. And she's like, I know. And she like finally copped to that the mirror was like another element.
Wow.
So it was, I think for her, like, I don't know, it's right. Like, if I hadn't noticed that, would I have started photographing her Like, was I responding to something that she was showing me? Was she responding to something that I wanted? Like, I feel like that's also, like, blurred, but clearly she enjoyed, like, being seen in that way.
That's so interesting because actually, like, I feel like one impetus, maybe less conscious at the beginning, but one impetus that I had when photographing my mom is that, like, I feel that she never looks at the mirror. Like, she has really no, and of course she has awareness of herself and she knows what she looks like and she, you know, attends to her appearance in certain ways, but, like, in a very different way. She seems to have really no...
vanity?
Yeah, let's say, as a convenient way of... she's not worried that much about her presentation. She's more worried about, like, her interactions with people and the kind of emotional connection she has with people. And I always thought that was... I noticed that was very rare. You know, I didn't meet a lot of people who had that sort of relationship to themselves that was sort of like a certain divestment in one's appearance or one's kind of aesthetics. So it's just very interesting to hear, you know, kind of the very opposite version coming from your kid.
Yeah. So we had talked a little bit about, like, I had talked to you about how in Rachel's essay, I really loved how she, like, highlights this kind of two-way channel of, like, hyper-focus, like how, you know, she's, like, so looking at her children, but she also is aware that they're, like, looking at her. And I hadn't really, like, thought about that. And it was, like, around the same time that I was reading Rachel's essay to your book that I had a girlfriend, like, tell me how she had, like, pointed out this, like, thing on her body to her son that she had just noticed, and her son kind of gave her, like, a duh, mom, like, yeah, I've, like, known about that, like, muscle for, like, ever, you know?
Oh, right, yeah.
And she was like, oh, like, I didn't, you know? And she, like, realized, like, oh my God, like, I'm
being observed.
I'm observed, like, day in and day out, when I'm sick, when I'm happy, when I'm mad, when I'm in my pajamas, like, when I'm dressed up for work, like, it's like you're seeing the full spectrum, so to speak. And so, like, you just mentioned kind of, like, being aware of your mom's, like, lack of vanity. And, like, I guess I'm curious about we talked a little bit about it before, but, like, your relationship to kind of, like, observing her and seeing her as a child, and, like, how aware of her visibility or invisibility you felt
when I was a child.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think, I'm not sure if this is, like, what you're asking me, but something that comes to mind is just thinking through my own process of making the work with her. I feel like there were a few different sort of different, like, approaches I was taking, whether consciously or not. And one of them was very much this idea of sort of fantasy or, like, wish fulfillment, where I actually felt that actually my mom, you know, an attendance to her aesthetics or her appearance might actually substantively change my mom and change her identity and change how she could interact with the world and what she could kind of get out of the world. And I was kind of just generally curious about that. You know, because she's my mom, I necessarily have a sort of preternatural embarrassment about her, which you write about in the book too. Is that's just, like, a relationship that people have to their family. It's like I can't escape them. So, like, my response to that is just be embarrassed.
It's like, you know, because it's like an extension of yourself, but that you can't control.
Exactly.
So it's like a rogue extension of yourself. Where you're like, what am I going to connote to the world? But, like, I have no power.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I think there was definitely an aspect of me sort of, like, asserting a bit of a control and saying, like, well, actually, I could make you look more masculine, or I could apply hair and makeup to you, which you never wear makeup, you never wear heels, like, you don't perform femininity in any way, which is totally fine for me, but, like, what would that look like for you to perform that, or perform masculinity more directly, or to perform any type of identity that is maybe different than what you're performing in your day-to-day, and, like, what does that mean? How does that actually change? Does it actually change you? And if so, how? And what are the mechanisms of that? I mean, that was, again, to kind of go back to your question about hair and makeup, that was definitely something that was going on in my mind there too, is, like, what are the actual mechanics of identity? You know, because if you apply makeup to someone, or you sort of, like, emphasize certain aspects of them, what impact does it actually have? Of course, there's, like, an aesthetic change, but there's a feeling that then there's something else, like, that happens.
There's, like, a reason that, like, lawyers wear heels in court, and
right.
You know, people,
like, those types of aesthetics actually connote certain types of power and things like that. And actually thinking about that, you know, that obviously makes me think about gender and the roles of gender, and the roles of bodies, and, like, which bodies are allowed to do what types of things. And there's a lot of that obviously happening in your book. You know, there's a couple threads there's obviously the gendered component of, you know, the fear that women have about violence and what women's bodies are allowed to do and how precarious they are or aren't, versus, you know, you write about how men are able to occupy certain types of space in different ways and how there's maybe an asymmetry there, you know, and this is a conversation we're all aware about, is that, you know, that gender asymmetry. But then also, you know, you're photographing children, and there's obviously a big discourse too about, in most of the pictures, I think maybe all of the pictures, the children are naked or nude. So, you know, is it okay to photograph children in the nude, and how is it okay? Who has ownership over their bodies? You know, you write very explicitly, like, you feel that there's a threshold, or you want to create a space where you are allowed to kind of own their body. And actually, Rachel, in her essay in my book, also talks a little bit about, like, this idea of ownership.
It's not really like a space to own their body. It's like, it's more basically an understanding that, like, any female nude body is, like, codified and sexualized in society.
Right.
Like, even, you know, from an art historical standpoint.
Sure.
And if there was ever a place where we could attempt to, like, carve out a space where that wouldn't happen, it should seem that, like, babies and small children would, like, be that space.
That's interesting because, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but when I think about, like, the dynamic of our books, where, like, in a weird way, I also feel that I can do this with my mother because she's on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, where she's, you know, she just turned 70 this year, and she has a sort of, like, her body and, like, the utility of her body is in a different place.
Like, past its ideal sexualization.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so I'm attempting this pre, and you're attempting this, like, post, right? But it's like, but the problem is that actually those spaces don't exist. Like, there's not, like, there isn't, like, no matter how young or how old you are, I think actually, like, you can kind of, you know, there's a little bit more room because you're not, like, what the ideal theoretically, but, like, that space is already filled with, like, so many years of sexualization, objectification, that it's not possible to detach yourself from it. Yeah. And so for me, like, so my picture is, like, first of all, like, I mean, I think many parents will just, like, kids are really naked a lot. Like, it's just actually, and for part of this book, I was in the Caribbean, so it was really hot. So my kids were, like, actually really naked, like, all the time. Yeah. And so for me, it was like, I felt like there was a fidelity to my maternal experience that I was trying to keep with, where it almost felt like telling them to put clothes on was basically saying, I know your bodies will be sexualized and we should stop that from happening, which seemed like a less interesting discourse to me than saying, like, is there a place where your bodies could exist unsexualized? Right. Even if there isn't, right? Like, it seemed more compelling and interesting to ask it rather than answer it in advance.
Well, and then there's a similar kind of relationship to control that we were talking about in different aspects before, where it's like you actually have no control over whether someone's sexualized or not. Totally, yeah. And you don't really have control over your own body either. I mean, that's, like, again, the specter of violence that is very gendered as well, is that, like, there's a feeling maybe, and I'm not a woman, so I don't really know, but I gather that there's a feeling that, like, you don't necessarily have full control over your body, and that actually impacts how you navigate the world. Right. Or, like, you know, I might think twice, like, I run a lot, but maybe if it was, like, 9:00 at night, I'd be like, oh, maybe this isn't the best time to go out for a run, but I'm not sure, like, my husband, that thought would, like, cross his mind have that for sure as a man. Yeah, so. So just an awareness that you have to have this kind of hyper awareness of, like, the theoretical, what could happen to you or something. Yeah. You know, based on gender, which is, like, almost feels like a random reason to have to, like, think these other things through. Right? Yeah, sure. Yeah, and that was interesting too when we were talking earlier, and, like, I was sort of like, why do you want to talk to me, basically? You know, aside from the obvious, like, motherhood connection, is you said to me that you were curious about, like, sons looking at their mothers. Yeah. So there's obviously a gendered aspect there, and I'm curious to hear more about why that was interesting to you, or what was curious to you about that. Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, when I just think about, like, self-gender construction and, like, what we take away from our parents or our observations of our parents in terms of our, like, own gender construction of self, like, I was curious, like, what
boys might be taking away from their mothers as part of that construction, and not having any sons and also not being raised with a father, it felt like my least accessible entry point in that direction. And so I felt the most like intrigued by it. Like it was something I couldn't fully unpack on my own because I had no access to it.
Right.
And so then I was like, oh, this would like, here's my attractive thinking, but like it could be totally opened up this way if I had like access to this other kind of understanding of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if there is like, if you feel like you have like thoughts on how that like,
yeah, well, it's interesting for me because, I'm a queer person. And so, a lot of people come to me with this sort of expectation of Oedipus, right? They're like, okay, it's the son looking at the mother. And like, there's this sort of like known, at least in like the Western philosophical tradition, there is like an idea that there is some like sexuality baked in there. There is some sort of like strange orthogonal relationship to desire or whatever. And me as a queer person, I'm sort of like, well, I don't know, the Oedipal thing, it seems very straight for me, like I don't really have that type of, or if I have that type of perspective on my parent and my mom, it's like a very abstract one that I've interpreted from like hearing about it.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like, I think my queerness has really complicated what role my gender presentation and my sort of the way that I'm sort of gendered in public, how that relates, how that affects like the way that I look at my mom.
I was wondering like what you would, in terms of people coming to you with this like idea of Oedipal complex, like what kind of questions you think you would be getting asked if you weren't queer? Do you think people would think that your work was like weirder as a straight man, like photographing his mom naked? Or like, do you think it would be... How do you think it would land differently?
I have no idea. I mean, you mentioned that you also wanted to talk to Leela Dare, who has his project with his mom. He's a straight identified man, I gather, cis man, and he takes very sexualized pictures of his mother. And I guess you'd have to ask him, because I think that's how I imagine I would be perceived in maybe a similar way. I mean, obviously, my relationship with my mother is extremely different, I think, from his relationship with his, and I haven't talked to him, so I don't really know. I can only kind of project based on what I've read and seen. But, I have no idea. It's the same thing with you. It's like, I have no access to that. Like, I've never been straight, and I've never really identified as straight, so I can't really imagine how people would perceive that relationship. But yeah, I don't know. When I think about my queerness and in kind of relationship to this work, more so what I think about is how my queerness has sort of allowed me to understand that these roles of like, that we imagine are kind of fixed, these sort of familial roles of mother and child, or like parent and child, or whatever, or even author and subject, photographer and object, or sitter, audience and maker. All these types of things are actually sort of, they're kind of hollow. You can kind of fill them with a lot of different things. Yeah, they're sort of essential but arbitrary, which is a phrase I like to use a lot, where they're kind of playthings. Like, they have a presence. They have there's something to them. They exist for a reason, and they have a lot of sort of social expectations that have accrued to them.
Sure.
But they are like actually toys that you can play with. I also like to use the metaphor of like a box that you can fill with certain things. Right. And like some things are a bit too heavy and like the bottom of the box will fall out, and some things will like push the sides of the box open and make it a little bit pliable, or change the shape of the box a little bit. But and so for me, like, my kind of queerness as it relates to this book is more just like utilizing that awareness that like, okay, the fact that people think that I'm a man, people ascribe cis maleness to me, okay, well, I don't have like there's no heterosexuality there. So like this Oedipal thing is just like a thing that I can use. Right.
How can I shift this?
Yeah. Exactly.
I also wanted to ask you, the last time that we spoke, you had this really kind of lovely example when I asked you about like looking at your mom as a child, where you kind of said that like, because she was so present and around so much, and you saw her, she was so visible to you that she was also invisible. Mm-hmm. She like lost visibility. I was wondering if the act of photographing her reinscribed visibility for you, or felt like an extension of that invisibility.
Yeah.
She was like malleable to you and it was still invisible, her selfhood, or whether you were like the distance of the camera kind of created a lens, no puns intended,
right.
to like see her.
Yeah, no, yeah. I remember we were talking about this earlier in our pre-conversation for this of, I think like there was sort of like prior to photographing her in this way, like she was like on my eye. Like there was no difference. Like my eye and her, there was no space there, like she was this thing that I like was like essentially invisible to me. I had such a formed, concrete idea of who she was, what role she occupied for me, what type of identity she had, and how that worked in the world. And then, by having a bit of a remove or like a barrier of photography, there is a moment where you have to sort of like contend with the fact that that's like, there is actually distance between the object and your eye and the way that you look at it. And what do you do with that distance? And what does that distance actually even mean? Which to me is, again, relating to questions of control, about, essentially what that space connotes is like autonomy. That means that she actually has control over herself that is distinct from my control over her, and my control over myself. So I do think that, working through this project with her definitely did. There was a process of externalization, which is in a way like an essential component of giving credence to someone's identity and someone's autonomy and someone's selfhood, which, as I've already described, is like an ongoing process. I don't know if I'll ever fully reconcile, my kind of ownership feelings over her with her actual like autonomy. But
I mean, it's probably not possible, but there's something, I guess, about her becoming like a subject in a different way that allows you to kind of see her as other than, or like your mom, but, or your mom, and also like, kind of, it's like
this kind of multiplicity is very interesting for me.
I don't think you can escape the mom, but like you can get like an ellipses. And
it was interesting because I remember when I was like I think a frankly less mature photographer, or like less mature person, because this is spanned over 10 years. So like earlier in the project, I remember sort of kind of trying to trick my audience a little bit and sort of use the kind of closed quality of photography to sort of like maybe convince people that my mother was maybe different than she actually is, in a kind of way. Not in like a malicious or whatever, but just as like, there is that power in photography.
I could do that.
Where like photography has a border, so it kind of like cuts away certain biographical or contextual aspects, and like there's power there, You
can control the narrative.
You can control the narrative to some extent.
Being told.
And the more that I did that, and the more work I made, and the more I interacted with her, the more I realized, like, no, that's not even real. Like, there's an idea that control exists, but actually, like, audiences are much more intelligent than we often give as authors. We often like credit. I don't think we give as much credit to the audience oftentimes as we should. Where it occurred to me that like my audience will know if I'm lying to them. You know what I mean? And it's actually more interesting to sort of like allow the bleeding of reality, quote unquote reality, whatever that is, allow those kind of corners and weird like distortions and sort of like mismatches. Be visible and be present and sort of like be upfront with them.
Totally. I mean, the last time we talked, I was telling you how I had just got like, kind of had become very uneasy at like the attempt of a photographic project to kind of like pretend it was an authority on something, or like the whole story, and how kind of allowing like the artifice, or I think I was telling you like, my seamless is always showing, like my literal seamless, or like my tripod leg, because to me it's like kind of more interesting to like highlight the act that this, like, what does it mean that this is being shot in this way for this reason, as opposed to like, look, this could have just been like, this is like just perfectly flawless, smooth, like,
and it is a kind of like generosity to the audience in a way. I feel it's sort of like,
because you're saying giving like your own,
well, it's also like honoring their like their,
Sure,
you know, their like powers of observation and intuition, and like, allowing them to be like, we are all aware that this is.
Or it's like, in my head, I also think of it, I think like, you know, we were saying like the end of my writing, I talk about how like, I put us in a hole that we can't get out of. And basically it's just like, I'm kind of saying like, I've asked us all these questions, but I can't give you any answers because like, I don't have these answers. I'm like not pretending to have them, but like, is it helpful or interesting for you to be asking them to, or to like you to be thinking about them too? But I'm not going to pretend that like I sorted it out because
right. We just dug the hole. Like, we didn't build the ladder. Yeah.
Maybe I'll push you into it, but I can't. No.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Well. Yeah. And that's one thing I wanted to talk to you about too. Speaking of, is this idea of like vessels and sort of like empty space that can maybe contain something that I feel is very present in your book. You know, the images themselves really often depict, from my perspective, a type of emptiness or an openness or sort of like almost like aloneness. You know, there's this interesting dynamic between presence and absence that you talk about very explicitly. What did you say? You said, I wrote a quote from the book. You said, so you're writing about how when you drive with your children, normally you have the rearview mirror tilted so that you can see them, not the back of the car. And then when they're not in the car, you still have the mirror tilted, and then you look, and then it's an emptiness. It's a lack of children. And you would describe that as a relentless presence despite physical absence. And so, I think there's a really interesting dynamic in your work, in this book, about, things being, this like idea of like digging a hole and then what fills the hole. And then kind of, you make that really literal with this idea of a vessel. You have lots of pictures of these ceramic, sort of very kind of naive or kind of clumsy, as you describe them, ceramic vessels. And you talk a lot in the writing about just like what does a vessel mean? What is a vessel doing? And in my book too, in the interview between my mom and Miranda July, they also use this term vessel about how the experience of making the work and actually the work itself might actually be a vessel for people to sort of fill with whatever they're bringing to whatever arises from the project for them. And I just wanted to hear about that for you.
I mean, that's also like a lot of things, but so that. I guess when I think about like death and I think about parenting, there is this like interconnectedness in so much as like one of the darker aspects of parenting to me has been like an inability to shake parenthood even when you're not parenting. So like how, there's kind of all this idea of like, there's so much dialogue on like self-care for like moms and like you need to like go off and like do your own thing or like get a night out, go away. Like, but like what is actually like the harder thing is like that you can't really go away. Like it literally, it's like all encompassing in this way where like regardless of whether you're like literally enacting the role in that moment, there's kind of like an unshakability to to untether yourself from that role. And maybe that will change as my kids get older. Maybe it's because they're like so young, but it's like I could just be
not
like,
sure.
Who knows? I'll ask your mom. I won't ask your mom for tips. No.
I mean, we should have had her come. I realized actually, but
I almost said something the last time we talked. Like, does your mom want to come?
But
then you're like, I need some space for my mom.
We do need that space I was talking about earlier. It's important. It's important.
So it is like that, but that is actually like one of the darker aspects of parenthood to me is that you can't shake it. It's like, so there's like kind of a permanent beholdenness. And I think like, so much like effort, so much talk goes into like keeping your like kids safe when they're babies. And then it's like, I remember when I realized like after my kids weren't babies anymore that like bad stuff could still happen. Like I hadn't even projected it into that space. And I was like, oh my God. And I just remember having this feeling, you're never safe.
We're back to the anxiety, the prophylaxis.
You're never done. Like there's at any moment, like, theoretically something could happen. And so like, well, how does that, like, you're always parenting even when you're like not parenting. And I feel like death, like the idea of like loss of someone is like also something that permeates, like they're not there. They're literally not there. But still, like, the present is kind of always imbued with, like, the loss of them or the past of them in the same way that, like, even when you're not parenting, like, that's still an element. So I see, like, those two things interconnected in that way. The vessels, like, for me have a couple, like, so they're all, like, vessels that have been made by amateur ceramicists, but then, like, donated to thrift stores. So like I bought them all from thrift stores, and some of them I like built sculptures out of, but like I didn't make them. I like, you know, I made them into other things. But and so I was thinking about how they like all serve this purpose, and they do it in this really clunky kind of way because they're like not that good, which kind of is a metaphor like for me and like parenting, because I have this theory like no matter how good a parent you are, you're like gonna fuck your kid up in some way. It's like not possible. Yeah. So like we're all kind of just like struggling along to like do whatever the best we can. But then like there is this kind of dark ending where like they have been discarded. So like at the end of the day, like part of being a good parent is like the inability to like be gracefully discarded or something, right? When you're like realize that your function in that way is like no longer serving that same purpose of like because their vessels is like they held water or something like more life-giving. And so like I'm not saying that you're like completely discarded, like you have no like I see how my adult friends, their parents are still totally like poignant aspects of their life, but they're not like literally keeping them alive in the same way like as they were young kids. So like part of growing into your new parent role is like learning how to like let go of those kind of more rote caretaking. Yeah, which to me again is this idea of like propriety in a certain way, or like ownership. Yeah, where you have to. And then I also think like because clay comes from the ground. And so then it goes back to the ground. So it's like kind of like your body going back to the ground too. Like and you have these really beautiful photos of caves that use caves, right? They're like ancient tombs. They were like carved out in caves for bodies to like go into, like at rest and death in Sicily. Yeah. So again, which is where my family is from. Oh, okay. Yeah. So then again, there's this like earthen relationship like to vessels. The earth, And then like they're also kind of womb-like too in some ways. Sure, right? Of course. Like vessel obvious, is we can get Yannick in that. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Okay, and let's have I had a question for the photo technical nerds, right? Is that I noticed so you have photograms in the book, which are photograms you made out of your mother's ashes. Yes. And first, tell me about that. But also, I noted that you have a different treatment on the paper. So just for the people who are material oriented, we can talk about that, and also just generally why you included that type of work in the process. Sure. Well, so in general, like the book has a lot of visual strategies. I mean, kind of like your book, right? You have like these kind of fashion, these like more casual, like there's like a lot of mix of styles, right? Sure. Which is one reason why I thought like that we had a nice overlap actually. But for me, like the multiple visual strategies in general, like came kind of out of like a boredom of photography. Or just like tired of seeing like very succinct kind of projects that again, like something about the succinct like repetitiveness of like the same way of looking almost to me implied an authority that felt like insincere. Sure, yeah. I've been thinking a lot about like where, we're talking about conventions of motherhood or roles in society or whatever. And to me, when I think about it, like all of that stuff is actually, there's maybe some like essential quality there that sort of is the basis with which those exist. But actually what they are is a sort of accumulation of people doing it, like people behaving that way over time. Right. And so it creates a category. Right. But so like, and then also in terms of what you were saying about like audience, like how much credit can we give our audience? I kind of like gave myself this query that was like I almost was thinking of it like juggling. Like how many different balls can I throw up in the air? And like maybe for a second they're like all in the air and like everything makes sense, but like maybe then they come crashing down and you're like, what the hell just happened? But it was like a question, like how many different things can I put in that will still coalesce? Yeah, and I want the coalescing to happen, but I want like it to be a little bit more of a puzzle. And so the role that the photograms fulfill is like I really, I knew that so much of like my becoming a mother was like predicated on my experience with my mother, who is no longer alive. And so kind of there's this general idea of like, how do I bring this person who's literally not here into this space? And I didn't want it to have like some kind of archival family, like no direct representation or whatever, no disrespect to that kind of work, but I knew that for this project I didn't want like family album pictures or something like that. Sure. So I was like, how can I include her? I had these ashes. And so I started asking myself like, well, because when I was making the hidden mother pictures with like myself and my daughter, was like, well, like should I be sitting on someone's lap? Should there be like another mother? Like should I be the baby? And I was like, well, how could I like make other family portraits? And so I had these ashes, and I started making these photograms where the idea was that like my mom like literally like physically had touched the paper because it was like her body, and then they all have kind of like my hand or a trace of my body in them, and I was kind of thinking of them as like morbid family portraits at first, like a way to bring like her body and my body, like to revive her dead body into like the physical sphere with my body, like to make a contemporary portrait of us. So that's how they came into being. And the reason that they're like slightly smaller than the other, or like they're all at the actual physical dimensions of the 8x10 analog paper, because it's important to me that the object, which is what she touched, is like would be retained, the objects. Like if they were in a show, they would never be enlarged. They would always be those objects. So I wanted to like, obviously it's like reproduced in the book, but I wanted to kind of replicate that idea that they were like
there's a certain like veracity there or something.
And then I think that like the varnish, like the gloss of the varnish, like actually gives them this more lifelike presence than the matte paper, where they kind of step into like a different they occupy a different space that feels more vibrant. And it's kind of interesting that they have this vibrancy even though they speak so much to death, right? So there's like a flip that they become like the more vibrant jewel-like aspect in the book, even though they're like speaking to this lack of presence or something. I don't know. But it's like, again, this idea of like how do you like give life to a body that isn't there to actually occupy that space.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, and it strikes me actually writing is another way of doing that, generally speaking.
Totally. I mean, you brought up that comment on like both photos and words like are a way of like memorializing. And I remember like literally like after my mom died, like 2 days later I was like working. I was nannying in New York City, and I was waiting for the kid I was nannying to like get off her school bus. And I remember just frantically like writing like every memory of my mom, because I was like worried like I would forget. And so I would just like sitting there like it started like a letter to her, like, dear mama, and then it was like, I remember this, you used to say this, you used to wear this, because it was like someday like maybe I wouldn't remember that you said this, and it was like this fear of like having to like, you know, contain this like being that now
set
is
it
like,
down.
And I do, and you know, I think that the act of photographing for a lot of people, it hasn't historically been for me, but it, you know, obviously so tethered to like memory and fear of forgetting and anxiety of loss, and like, you know, we could get Bart's about it, but
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it just like there's no denying that photography and memory are just they're in bed together. You know, it's like, you know, work like photographic artwork or whatever is one thing, but like even as I make my own work, my phone is just full of other things, my memories. You know, and I'm like taking pictures of them not only for like an artistic impulse to satisfy an artistic impulse, but also just like I want to fucking remember what that looked like or whatever. So yeah, that's interesting.
I don't know, should we?
Yeah, I feel like we've talked a lot. Yeah. Yeah, I've covered all my notes, more or less.
Actually, I have one question for you.
Sure.
I know that you come to this from like a performance and dance background. And I was thinking, like, so for me, I come to image making also from a sculptural background, which I think is like kind of visible and like building and constructing. And I was wondering what you would say about the impact of your performance and your dance history on your image making.
Well, first I should include a caveat that, you know, I really dropped my sort of like dance performative life in college, so it's a little. I always feel a little facetious when I have like conversations with people and I'm like, well, you used to be a dancer. And I'm like, well, yes, I did. But, you know, it's like maybe I don't want to overblow that aspect. But I did absolutely come to photography through trying to make work that was about performance and about gesture and about dance. And for me, initially, I started photography just to like, again, like set down, you know, kind of memorialize in a way certain types of things that necessarily had a kind of like lived, embodied process to them. So for me, performance is, you know, and also there's a lot of conversation and discourse already about how photography is a performance, and there's, you know, people perform for the camera whether they realize it or not, or even if they're not performing for the camera, the photograph itself sort of like creates a performance out of whatever is being kind of documented or depicted. So for me, like, that's just something that's like very forefront in my mind, is the sort of performative dynamic of making pictures in the first place, which I think we kind of already touched around, even this idea of like leaving the tripod visible or the seamless. It's like acknowledging that there's a performance here. So for me, like, that's definitely like comes from my experience of that, and sort of bringing that initially to my photographic process from the very outset. And then, of course, you know, for me, I think I just have a sort of general obsession with the body and how it occupies space, and not only kind of physical space, but also pictorial space. So, you know, I think that's where I really draw in those that background, let's call it, is in like seeing how people occupy space. And that's like a really interesting, that seems like a life's work can be spent, you know, thinking about that. And so, that's where I bring a lot of that type of experience.
All right. Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still figuring it out, you know. I don't know. There's not really like a one-to-one.
Yeah, but it's like interesting how like certain interests get like absorbed into other interests.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, like if you're not performing or dancing now, but it's like it still has a life within this other medium, like what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because that was one thing I was thinking about with like the watercolors and the collage. Like, how do you bring in like, what does it look like to like use one medium?
Yeah.
To, like, that you know is gonna kind of just be absorbed by another medium, but isn't the end all be all in and of itself, you know, to like make for another making, so to speak. Yeah.
Are you talking about the watercolors that you have in your book?
Yeah. Like,
I guess the cover even is watercolor. Yeah.
Because I feel like I always have like these little bastard like mediums that I do stuff in, but that are like adjacent to photography. And so when I was like bored, one of the things I was thinking of was like, well, how can I take these adjacent mediums and actually like make them part of my photographic practice? Right? Yeah,
there's also a drawing of like one of your kids' bodies, I guess, which you made.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So I actually made that drawing from a photograph.
Right.
That was needed to be removed from the book for distribution purposes.
Going
back to our like
oh wow, I didn't realize that it got that like practical.
Yeah, so it's not even a drawing, it's like literally a trace of the photo, because it was this way of me. So there were just like a few countries that wouldn't distribute the book with this photo in it. And so we had to make this decision, like, will we remove it? Will we not remove it? And then I actually thought that so much, going back to anxiety, so much of the writing in the book kind of talked about this theoretical anxiety of like what happens if you are sexualized, and then like it happened, kind of like basically by saying
so
that
interesting. And this sort of like litigious relationship to people's bodies is so interesting too.
And so then I was like, well, it's a kind of, maybe the more interesting thing is to like fold it in to this discourse and kind of like acknowledge like this is just a trace of this thing that was here, which can't be here because the space that I wanted to create is already filled. Like it can't be carved out because you're already sexualized. But I wanted to make it like a drawing to kind of be in dialogue with the other drawings.
That's so interesting too, because also presumably they're not allowing that type of depiction as a sort of like prophylactic anxiety towards the children and like protecting children from a type of sexual violence. Wow, that's so complicated.
On that upper note.
Well then,
Well, thanks so much for coming out for your time today.
No, I had such a great time talking with you.